Today, we'll touch on Togo, where there is a seemingly lack of governance and citizens' fear of an institutional coup. In the meantime, the U.S. begins offloading deportees to East Africa. First of all, Rwanda has received its first group, and next is Uganda. This is The Conversation. I'm Darshan Usman. Let's talk. Now, it's been months since Faure Gnassingbé took office as president of the Council of Ministers, and that happened on May 3rd, 2025. Yet, he still has not named a new cabinet. So outgoing ministers are running the government, or a caretaker government, if you might call it. And the constitutional switch that scrapped direct presidential elections has fueled protests, arrests, and media suspensions, and ultimately leaving many Togolese anxious and unsure of who is really in charge. Now, today on The Conversation, I'm joined by Mikatekiso Kubayi. He's a senior researcher, Institute for Global Dialogue in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us at this time, Mr. Kubayi.
My sister, for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Now, I know the last time we talked about why the government or government has not been named, who's running the country, and the fact that, the Constitution now creates a president of Council of Ministers. Now, can you talk to us, because a lot of people seem to call this, what's happening in Togo, an institutional coup d'etat. So speak to us on what that means, and if you feel it's just a political spin or a real legal problem?
It could be all of the above, my sister. I was trying to explain the last time that, firstly, this is not a normal, situation. A normal situation, you'd have elections, you'd have an administration elected into office, you'd have a team already. In fact, ahead of elections, you'd have a team already in place. At least even if it's a rough set of names by a president or a would-be president, and so on. So you'd expect things to be fairly smoother. But this is not an ordinary, normal situation. You've had a change in the constitution. You've had, a backlash, over that, very change. You've got young people not, taking it, lightly, and there's a little bit of, acrimony, among young people over this shift. Some, are justified, in saying, but perhaps this is a power grab and a chance to extend, tenure in office. Because power has been shifted from the office of the president to that of the prime minister, where the incumbent locates himself. So in a situation like this, obviously, because it's not normal, you would expect that there would be massive consultations, a lot of consultations. There would be a lot of calculation that goes into it, how the cabinet is going to work going forward, the future relationships, balancing interests. Interests, particularly of those that would have assisted, in the process, that has led to this point, allies, friends, and so on and so forth. So it takes quite a bit of doing. So if, for instance, you have a situation where there's a controversy, wide-ranging controversy, such as in this case, and there are many parties, parties by people, entities, feeling this isn't quite as legitimate as it ought to be. There would obviously be some of those some tendency to delay a little bit, to consider, both pressure, to change, or pressure to appoint this one or the other.
Well, speaking of legitimacy, you did say earlier that this is not normal, and we know that shortly after the announcement in June, protesters were rounded up, Dozens of them were arrested. Even rights groups have actually said some were tortured. Now, what does this tell us about how the state is handling dissent in the country?
It's unfortunate, but it seems to be a repetitive action, on the continent. Not too long ago, we saw similar scenes, in Kenya, for instance. And it seems to be a repetitive action. Ideally, what you'd want is engagement with community, engagement with society, engagement with stakeholders, all stakeholders, and consult as widely as possible. So you can't, for instance, impose constitutional amendment on a people that don't want it, because the state belongs to the people and not the individuals that are employed to run the state. So you have to there has to be consultation. I mean, after all, if you are going to claim that you have a democracy, that you have free elections, you have a constitutional system, you have a parliament, you have a legislature, you have an executive, you have a judiciary, and all of those important components of a democratic state, then you have to do according to what is known for of democracies. Consult the people, the stakeholders, the owners of this democracy. So if that doesn't happen, naturally, you would have angst among the population, and this sort of action would result. Okay. It's just unfortunate that they've decided to take this route, of manhandling, society that correctly has an argument. That is an argument. That is a fair, genuine argument to say that, hang on, let's have another look at this thing. There's nothing wrong with society saying we do not like what is happening.
Absolutely. Still speaking on society coming out to protest, saying that they're not comfortable or happy with what is happening in their countries. We know that during the time of the protests, the security forces, are accused of being used to break up some of these rallies. So in such cases, would you say that we're seeing militarization of politics in Togo? If yes, where do you think that will lead to?
I think we all know the answer to that, to where that will lead to, my sister. We've seen this happening over and over and over again, both on the continent, actually even outside of the continent. Whenever you use repression against a people that have, especially when they have a genuine argument, to say that we do not like this matter because of 1, 2, 3, and the other reason. And you force it, you force them, you force it down their throats. And if they disagree, you arrest them, you manhandle them, you harm them, and you maim them, over something that belongs to them. That only breeds disaster. That only breeds disaster. No one wants to have, or wants to be in a illegitimate, government, because it is you unlikely to get any cooperation, among the population. Constant resistance, constant threat. You'd have to be looking over your shoulder all the time. Because you are not any legitimate, government in that sense. So consultation with the population is absolutely vital, especially if it is the choice of system that you have employed. You say you are a democracy, and then you have to act, according to democratic tenets, and those include, respecting citizens because they are the owners of that constitution. They are the owners of the state. They are the employers of the president and all of the people that actually man the state. So you have to consult, and refrain from violence. Only begets more violence, and ideally that is not what you'd want to have. Countries in Africa, are ideally, best placed, to focus on development, rather than internal conflict and strife. You need stability so that you can then focus, on rebuilding this continent, rebuilding the economies, of this continent.
You talk about stability and consultations, but we have the government coming out to compare this what is happening in Togo to long caretaker periods elsewhere, like where we know it's a standard practice, for example, in Pakistan, and it's also happened in places like Tunisia and Belgium as well. Would you say this is a fair comparison?
Well, look, you do have, by instances, where there's a bit of a delay, here, a delay there, right? But every circumstance, must be looked at, on its own merits, right? You can't, say because something happened in Belgium, therefore it must happen in Togo, or something happens in Togo, therefore it must happen in Pakistan, and circumstances you have to, act according to those material circumstances affecting that particular area at that particular point in time. What are the reasons in this instance for Togo following this particular development? What are the reasons? What is delaying the naming of an executive, for instance? There may be similar reasons to that that kept the announcement of a government in Belgium for about a year or so, or similar to what has been happening in Pakistan, but they may not, and it is for the administration to explain, to consult and communicate, with its population, with its citizens, those people that actually go out to vote all the time, whose tax actually, funds the operation of the state, to say that these are the circumstances. There is a delay because of one, two, or the other reason, and ideally would like to move and then reassure, that the current interim executive or interim administration will continue to render services, or perhaps even do more, take the country forward. But you can't leave it like that and simply say that no, it has happened elsewhere. That may well be, that may be all well and good. It happened there. They resolved it, but those were their circumstances. How do you resolve this one here, in Togo? That is what the administration ought to be engaging, with its population.
All right. Now, what about the opposition? How united would you say they are right now? Is there like a realistic alternative, or mostly what they have is just to protest, protest energy without a roadmap?
Well, my sister, in politics, anything is really possible. Things can happen overnight. Deals can be struck, overnight. We've seen this happen in many instances across the continent and the globe. However, the reality is, you had this constitutional amendment pushed, fairly without as much, resistance, to it. Only young people seem to be, coming out guns blazing, saying, no, not guns blazing per se, but, out in protest, to say that, hang on, let's review this thing. So if you had, an opposition that is strong enough, unless if the opposition maybe agrees with this, then that's a different conversation, altogether. But clearly, there isn't, enough sufficient opposition to this to halt it, or to, put, the necessary pressure. Maybe, some measure of agency is being applied, leading to this delay in announcing a new administration. Maybe someone or some institution or some people, are putting pressure, to say that no, let's have another look at this thing. So really, it's up to the administration in Togo to engage with its people and explain, in detail, and the steps that ought to follow. Instability of this nature does not help Togo. It does not help the region. It does not help the continent. So ideally, engagement, open transparency. That's what democracy is about. And Togo, in fact, part of the argument, for the constitutional amendment is democratic practice, isn't it? So if you make that, particular claim, then it has to follow that, you'd have, consultations, which are part and parcel of democracy. The people have to agree to what it is that you are doing, what it is that you are amending. So.
Oh, well, since the people do not agree with, what is happening at the moment, and, the government has come out to say that it is for continuity's sake, that's why they've decided to run a parliamentary system of government. Do you think that, will this change how the citizens' daily lives, and livelihoods run?
Well, certainly. I mean, the quality of an administration that you have, will definitely have a direct impact, on the daily, lived realities of ordinary people. It goes without saying because the state renders services, to the people. It looks after street lights, it looks after roads, it looks after provision of water, provision of energy, provision of education, and so on and so forth. So all of those, social services, economic services, the maintenance of economic infrastructure, the planning for economic and social infrastructure, the investment, for, in economic and social infrastructure, all of the things that are needed, to grow and develop, the economy of Togo, will be, certainly, impactful on the daily lived realities of people on the ground. So yes, certainly.
Okay, so now what's the role of, regional bodies, when it comes to what's happening in Togo? Talking about the likes of ECOWAS, AU, France, or even EU. Have they said anything that matters? Do you think that external pressure could change what is happening?
There are a couple of things there. This is happening in Africa. So ideally, the first port of call, would be ECOWAS, followed by, of course, and in close, cooperation with the African Union, to resolve, this matter. Now, they would then have to check, and consult themselves as well, by the way, extensively, on the merits, of any action or interventions that may be warranted, if at all. Right, they are warranted. Because, for example, I mean, if it's a constitutional amendment and you're hardly having, much opposition to this, constitutional amendment, some may argue that perhaps protests, are something that are, is something that is instigated by some element, somewhere that, is undemocratic, and that sort of thing. So there would have to be, obviously, careful consultation. You also have to understand that sometimes, there may be people that protest against, a particular leader, but there may also be those that support a particular leader as well. And you do not want, two, opposing support bases, clashing, and harming one another and harming the country and infrastructure, at the same time, as well. So yes, ECOWAS, would have to be, the first to look into the matter, in cooperation, of course, with the African Union, to look into the matter and try and resolve it as speedily as possible.
All right, so but what about, economic fallout? Okay, you're about to say something. Please go ahead.
I would be careful because quite often, on the continent, we've seen, other countries, other continents coming in, to resolve some of the matters that ought to be, fairly quickly, resolved by the African Union. So, for example, the African Union then comes out, appearing incapable, of administering, incapable of managing, the affairs of the continent as, is mandated, of it to do. So we continue to see, for example, the influence, overwhelming influence, of external parties, extending all the way, from the colonial era. So one would be, I mean, there's in discourse, on the continent, there's that feeling, that that has to slow down or be seized.
All right. I was actually going to ask, if there have been economic fallouts, like aid shifting, investors pulling out, or even any warning signals that we should look out for.
Well, I haven't seen any data, right now, that would indicate, a withdrawal of investment, a withdrawal, of trade, and so on. I haven't seen yet, any sanctions, that, have been effectively imposed, on Togo just yet on the back of this. So we have to wait and analyze it a little bit more to ascertain data on this, and then be able. One would normally expect some sort of repercussion of sorts, but remember that in any event Africa has been the smallest has had the lowest FDIs flowing into the continent compared to any other region in the globe. Very, very tiny, very, very minimal. So it would hardly it would be difficult to notice immediately. If you like, the sort of outcomes that you are inquiring about, but you have to check the data first. To see and monitor it, over a little bit of, a time to see, if there's any consistency, any variation, happening.
Well, you talked about, not having any data, but we also know that some media outlets like the RFI, the France 24, were suspended for 3 months. So, if you on the outside is finding it difficult to even, get a hold of some information, how much of the story are Togolese able to hear for themselves?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, if you clamp down on media, it's very difficult to see. But sometimes there are some entities, your IMF, your Bank of International Settlements, and such structures do record data. So trade data, for example, can be seen there. Maybe not all of it, maybe in patches, but there can be a certain amount of data that can be observed by those entities and reported on by those entities. So you'd be able to check there on the specific economic fallout that you may be referring to. Particularly if, for example, if say the European Union or any other entity decides we're going to, or even the African Union, we're going to place sanctions on Togo because of this, notwithstanding a possible argument from Togo to say that, hang on, this is a constitutional process. It's an amendment of the constitution. It's been voted for. It's been implemented, and so on and so forth. If they choose, to impose sanctions, on Togo, you'd have to then take, quite a bit of time to maybe, a business cycle to be able to see the impact, of, such an economic fallout. But sometimes you'd normally, I mean, if you have a solid, stock exchange, for instance, you'd see, some movement, in those spaces as well.
All right. So, but then, if they were to choose ministers now, how would you actually expect these ministers to be chosen under this new system? What parliamentary maths or even deals will they need to watch out for? Will we need to watch out for?
Well, depending on the balance of power. For example, I mean, if the current prime minister wants to maintain favor with other parties that are quite strong and influential in parliament, in the legislature, he may want to appoint some of the influential members to his cabinet, and then decide what strategic, whether or not to grant them strategic ministries or others. So it's a layered a process, I would argue, because you have to decide firstly if you're going to include others from other parties or remain or keep it from within your own party, and if you if in so you decide, which ministries, you decide on the strategic value. Every president would have to make that sort of consideration. But then, of course, in consultation with closest, allies, supporters, and so on.
Okay. Now, we're winding down now, but then do you think that what's happening in Togo would encourage similar constitutional moves elsewhere in West Africa? Because earlier you did say, you made mention of, the coup d'etats actually happening in some parts of Africa. Is this part of a regional pattern, or will this be part of a regional pattern?
Well, my sister, I certainly hope not. I certainly hope not, because ideally you want to move away, from this unconstitutional, change of government. But the problem, is that with this particular incident, with this particular case, you have to check, and ascertain first whether it is unconstitutional, because it's a constitutional amendment. Right, it's not an overthrow of a government, by military means. It's not that kind of coup d'etat. They call it some, and I see out there in discourse, they say it's an institutional coup d'etat, right? Not a military coup d'etat, that we're accustomed to, for example, that we see in other parts of the continent. So you would have to be very careful, when addressing this particular matter. So ECHO was going into discussions with and consultations, with the administration of in Togo. Would have to be very careful and sensitive, in approaching this matter with maturity, of course, so that you do not flare up, flare the situation up any further. You try to normalize, as far as possible, the current discourse there.
All right, so now let's have your final thoughts before we wrap up, Mr. Kubayi.
Yeah, look, my sister, it's really unfortunate that we keep having to discuss this over and over, on the continent. This Africa has been pushing for as much inflow of finance to invest in development, to invest in infrastructure, to invest in education, to invest in the future growth, and development of young people. For better futures. Now we can't afford to have a consistent battle with conflict all over the continent. We're currently experiencing something painful in the Sudan. We're facing this situation here as well, and the other pockets on the continent where it's DRC, for instance. It's quite painful, my sister, where Africa, instead of focusing on completely on development, on stability for development, on actions to attract finance for investment, that will bring industry onto the continent, that will bring jobs, that will bring infrastructure, that will bring an improved higher standard of living of Africans. We have to focus on this. It's unfortunate that constantly this has to be something that we talk about.
Quite unfortunate. Well, with that, would have to thank you so much for your time, Mikatekiso Kubayi, Senior Researcher, Institute for Global Dialogue in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you so much for speaking so passionately on this topic.